In this video, we'll talk about HTML tags that we'll use to create tables and forms. Let's first create a simple table like this. It will have 3 rows and 3 columns, and the first row will be a header row. Okay, so I'll use the AMAT abbreviations in case you forget. We'll start with HTML5, and then we'll need a table element. So let's have a table element. And then we'll just build the table row by row and cell by cell. So here we'll have 3 rows, and we'll do 3 TRs. Each TR creates 1 row. And then inside the first row, we'll have 3 cells. So each cell is either a TH tag, stands for header cell, or a TD tag, stands for a data cell. So we'll need 3 TH, and they will be item, quantity, and the price. Item, quantity, and price. And then for the next row, we'll have 3 TDs. There will be lamp 1, 15, so lamp 1 and 15. The next one will also have 3 TDs, and it will be book 2 and pen. So book 2 and pen. Okay, so this is what the table looks like, and let's see how it looks in a browser. Okay. So again, table element inside row by row. Each row is a TR. Each cell is either a header cell TH or a data cell TD. If we look at the table, it doesn't have a border, so it doesn't really quite look like a table. In HTML5, almost all table attributes, including the border attributes, are deprecated. We're supposed to use CSS to add table borders. But since we haven't covered CSS, we'll just use border attribute for now. And to add a border, just specify a border attribute and the width of the border in pixels. So we'll say border attribute here, and the width will be 1 pixel. And now it has a border and looks more like a table. We can also use a couple of more attributes to make the table look a little bit nicer. The cell padding attribute specifies the space between cell content and cell border. So here, let's say we'll have cell padding 5 pixels, and this increase the padding between the content and the border of the cell. And if we want to increase the space between cells, we can use cell spacing. So let's put cell spacing here, and let's make it 2 pixels. Okay, so that doesn't make too much difference, but this is what you want if you want to increase the spacing between cells. There are a few more tags related to tables. T-head and T-body are particularly important and very commonly used. So T-head can be used to group a number of rows into a table header, and T-body can be used to group a number of rows into a table body. let's format this. Format document. Okay. Now, visually, they don't actually make any difference, but I highly recommend that you use them because many UI libraries rely on them to add styling or effects to a table. So although you don't have to use t-head or t-body, it's highly recommended that you use them. Now, t-foot is much less used as not many tables have footers, and caption is somewhat useless because using a div for table caption is usually more flexible. If you do want to use a caption tag, remember to put it inside the table element and before t-head. So if we want to use a caption, it should be here. Let's say this is a product symbol. And this is how it looks like. As I said, oftentimes you are better off just put a div here and then style the div rather than using the caption tag. Now in Excel, you can merge several cells together to make a larger cell. We can also do this easily in HTML. But here, instead of thinking the big cell as several cells merging together, you should think of it as just one cell that's spanning multiple rows and or columns. For example, let's say we want to have a cell that occupies 2 columns. So let's start by adding another row, and let's put 2 TDs here. Notice that every other row has 3 TDs, but this one only has 2. And this is what it looks like. Note that because HTML tables are built row by row and then cell by cell in each row, it's possible to have different number of cells in different rows. They don't look good, but it's possible to have them. Now, we can make this cell to have a cost span of 2, meaning that it will span 2 columns. So we'll say cost span 2. And now you can see that this row matches the other rows because effectively it also has 3 columns. Now let's see what it looks like when we have a row span of 2. So let's add another row here, and this time let's put just one cell in there. So right now this row only has 1 column or 1 cell. Again, it doesn't match any other rows. But if we make this TD to have a row span of 2, now the last row matches the rest of the rows again. And that, of course, is because effectively this cell is spanning 2 rows, so it will occupy 2 columns in the last row plus an additional column here. So the last row now has three columns. And in HTML, we can also have nested tables. It's very easy to do. All you need to do is basically putting a table element inside a TD element. Now let's talk about forms. Forms are very important for web applications because they are one of the few ways you can get input from a user. Here's a simple form in HTML. Notice that there is a form element, and inside there are 2 input elements. They each has some attributes which we'll get to in a moment. So let's see this form in action. I'm going to create another page. Let's call it example 2, and page, and then the form. Whoops. Okay, so looks a bit messed up. Should be here. Come on. Let's try again. So, yes. And then let's format. Okay, so this is what it looks like. And let's open this in a browser. And this is what the form looks like in a browser. So if you compare what it looks like in a browser and the source code of the form, you can see that the form tag is not rendered by the browser, but the two input elements are shown as a input button here, input box here, and a button here. Now, if we look at the source code again, it's obvious that the type attribute of input determines how it's going to be rendered by browser. In particular, if the type is text, it's going to be rendered as a text input field. And if the type is submit, it's going to be a submit button. But what about the other attributes like name, value, method, actions, and so on? To understand those attributes, we must understand the purpose of a form. Unlike other HTML elements like table, which are used to display information to the users, form is used to get information from the users. Once a user fills out the form and clicks the submit button, the browser will take the data entered in the form and send it to a server-side program to be processed. Attributes like action, method, etc. are all related to this. So let's fill out the form and submit it and see what happens. As we can see, after we submit the form, we actually end up on Google search. Now pay attention to the URL in the address bar, which is what's shown here on this slide. We can compare it to the attributes in the form. First, notice that the main part of the URL, actually let's just show it here, it's easier to see. The main part of the URL is actually the value of the action attribute. It's actually this one. This is what the action attribute means. It's the URL of the server-side program that will process the data submitted from the form. Then notice that after the main part of the URL, there's a question mark followed by a couple of name-value pairs. This part is called query string. Each name-value pair is called a request parameter. Again, compare this with the HTML source. We can see that the data for each input element is submitted as a request parameter. The name attribute is the name of the request parameter, and the value attribute is the value of the request parameter. So originally, the input element has an empty value, but remember, the user typed in Java, right? And this becomes the value of that input element. And when we submit the form, Java becomes the value of the request parameter queue. Now, what about the method attribute? Well, the method attribute here tells the browser what type of HTTP request it should use to send their data to the server. The value of the attribute would be either get or post. If you don't specify the method attribute, it defaults to get. We'll learn more about HTTP request methods when we study HTTP requests. Now that we know the basics of HTML forms, let's look at what form controls we can create. The most versatile form element is input. As we saw, we can use it to create text input fields and buttons. By setting the type attribute to different values, we can also use it to create password field, checkboxes, radio buttons, and so on. Let's see some examples. So if we change this one to password, it still looks the same as before, but if you type in it, it won't show you the text anymore, because text field, of course, is intended for an password field is, of course, intended for entering password. You don't want people looking over your shoulders to see your passwords. And if we change this to, say, a checkbox, it becomes a checkbox. If we change this to radio, it becomes a radio button. And if we change this to file, it actually becomes a file field where you can click and then select a file, and you can actually submit a file to the server if you have a server-side program that can handle it. And one input field type that we'll often use later on is actually the hidden type. So a hidden type does not get rendered in browser, that's why it's called hidden. But when the form is submitted, the value of the hidden form field is also submitted to the server. And oftentimes you want to use a hidden form field to submit some additional data to the server, but that data may not be relevant to the user, so you don't need to show that to the user. Now, these are some very common input types that has been in HTML standard for a very, very long time. In HTML5 standards, there are even more input types added. And let's try one of them, the date type. So if we change this to date type, you can see that the browser actually renders a calendar that lets us to choose a date. We can either enter date manually, or we can choose this from the calendar. And if we submit, we can see that the date actually gets submitted to the server. So this is one of the new input types added in HTML5. Please check out the link document to see more. Many of those, like email, like URL, and so on, are quite useful. And we can also use input tag to create buttons. We already have a submit button here, and oftentimes you'll see a reset button. And a reset button resets a form to its original form, meaning that it will clear out all the user input. So if I click reset, it will clear out this field. There are some additional input attributes that are commonly used. Let's see some of them. So let's change this one back to text, and we'll have a placeholder here that says enter your query, for example. placeholder would put some placeholder text in a text field like this, and then we can have, for example, size is 40, and this sets the size of the field, and then we can say, for example, max length is 10. This ensures that no input in this field can exceed 10 characters. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Oh, I didn't refresh, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Yeah, so now I cannot enter anymore. And then, of course, you can have the minimum length. And then there are a few so-called Boolean attributes, meaning they are either true or false. For example, I can say this one is required. If a field is required, and if we try to submit the form without, right now we can actually submit the form because I didn't refresh. So let me refresh and then try to submit again. And now the browser gives us an error message saying, please fill out this field. That's because we have set this one to required. And if it's a radio button or checkbox, you can say this radio button or checkbox is checked. And if you want to disable some form fields, you can say disable and disabled or disabled. And now you can see that this input field is grayed out. I can no longer click on it or enter things into it. So these three attributes are known as Boolean attributes, and the way to set their values are different from other input elements. In HTML5 standards, there are several ways to set a Boolean attribute to true. One of the ways is what we did here. You simply say you simply put the attribute name there without any value, and that's considered setting the value to be true. Other ways of saying it's true is to put an empty value, like here, or the name of the attribute itself as a value, like here. A common mistake is to try to give it a value of yes or true, and that's not the right way to do it according to the HTML5 standard. There are a couple of more things related to checkboxes and radio buttons I want to mention. First, the typical way to use them is to have multiple input elements having the same name. For example, let's say we want to know the programming languages people know and their favorite color. So we can do something like this. This is my form, and let's say I'll say programming languages you know, and we'll have checkbox, and name is language, and value is, let's say, C, and we'll have C here, and let's do a few more, and I'll have Java here, value being Java, and I'll have Python here, and this one will be Python, and this will be what the, okay, so let's try to make it more readable. Okay, so this is what it looks like, and if I check C and Java, and submit. Why it's not submitting anything? Okay, so I guess let's try putting a query here and check this tool and click search. Okay, so I guess Google needs a query, otherwise it will redirect us to an empty search form. So notice that now we have submitted two additional request parameters, C and Java, which are the ones we checked, right? And the ones that are not checked are not submitted. And for checkboxes, we can check more than one, and let's try radio button. So we'll say favorite color, and let's also get 3 of them. And we'll have a radio button, and the radio button, and they will all have the same name, color, and this one will say red, this one will say green, this one will say blue, and we have R, red, green, and blue, like this. So notice that they are radio buttons, and in particular, they are radio buttons that have the same name, and the browser will ensure that only one of them can be checked at the same time, unlike checkboxes. So this is for checkboxes and radio buttons, and then oftentimes you would also want to use the button tag. Although you can use the input tag to create submit or reset buttons, sometimes it just makes sense to use a button tag which is intended specifically for buttons. Just like input, you can set a type to make it a submit button, which will be the default if you don't specify the type, or you can make it a reset button. So occasionally you can actually set the type to button, so you can create a button for decorative purpose, and the button itself doesn't really do anything in terms of submitting or resetting forms. And if we want a multi-line input area, we can use a text area instead of an input. So for example, let's get rid of this part, and let's say your comments, and we'll have a text area, name, give it a name, that's the comments. Remember, just like everything else, name is going to be the parameter name when we submit the form, and whatever entered here by the user will become the value of the request parameter. And so this is a text area. Let's add another line break to make it look better. So we'll add one here and one here. And you can use rows and columns attributes to control how many rows and columns the text area has. So we'll say rows will be 5 rows and columns will be 60. So the text area will look like this. And then select and option are used to create lists and drop-down lists. Let's take this one as an example. So another line break and put it here. And then this gives us a drop-down list. And note that here, the name of the select element will be used as a request parameter name, and the value of the selected option is a parameter value when we submit the form. So if again, let's put something here, and then we select good. Where is my submit button? Okay, so I guess I removed it. Let's add a submit button. So this time we're going to use a button, and we're going to say search. So we'll select good and enter query, so Google will be happy, and then we submit. So notice that now we have an actual request parameter here that says grade is B, right? And here, notice that we selected the second option. It's shown as good, but when we submit the form, it actually submits the value of the option, which is B here. Now, sometimes if you don't have a value attribute for your option, for example, if we remove value for A, and if we select this one and then submit, notice that now it submits the option text or this part as its value. Again, the name of the request parameter is the name of select. There are a couple of select attributes you can customize. The size attribute determines how many items are shown at the same time. By default, it's 1, so the list is a drop-down list. You can change it to more than 1 to make it a list. For example, here, if we say size is 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. So now you can see that it shows everything at the same time, and the drop-down list becomes a list. And we can also set the multiple attribute, which allows multiple options to be selected. So we can say multiple. Multiple here is a Boolean attribute, like what we said, just say multiple, and it sets it to true. And now, where is it? Now this time we can select, let me refresh, and okay, so now I can select multiple of them. As for option, well, there are some options. As we mentioned, you can omit the value attribute, and if you do, the option text will be submitted as a request parameter value. You can set an option to be selected. By default, it will select the first option, but you can say when the form is displayed, select passed. So set the selected attribute here, and by default it's showing passed. Okay? And let's remove this so it goes back to be a drop-down list. Now it's more clear that it selects passed as a default option. And then you can group multiple options into an option group. So let's grab this and replace this. And this is how it looks like. You will have a group of options plus one additional option. When you create a form, oftentimes you would want to use some labels to label the form fields, and for that you should use a label element. A label element has an attribute for, and the value should be the ID of the element this label is for. So here it should be the ID value of this element. This serves two purposes. First, when a user clicks on the label, the browser will automatically focus on the corresponding field. Secondly, for a visually impaired user, when the input field is selected, the screen reader will read the label, so the user will know what the input field is for. So in our example, we'll change this one to a label. And we'll say this one has an ID of, let's call it query, maybe. Yeah. And we'll say this one is for the query input field. So if I click on Google, notice that this input field is automatically focused because this label is for this field. It's like this. And occasionally, when you have a very big form, you can group some form controls together using field set like this. So let's grab this and put it somewhere. Let's put it after this. And this is how it looks like. Notice that the legend is the label around the border, and inside the border you have your form controls. So this is pretty much it about HTML tables and forms. See you in the next video.